Okay, so today on Behind the Mix, I'm going to be breaking down a cover song that I did, some 41 pieces. I'm pretty happy with how that turned out. Originally, I was just going to make it vocal and guitar, but then I just started kind of messing with pianos and strings, and I turned it into a full production. I'm really happy how it sounds, and I hope you can learn something from this little tutorial. So let's just go from the beginning. I wanted it to build up throughout the song. So initially it just starts with guitars. So I recorded a Golden A6 through a Chandler preamp, and I used the acoustic sounding pickup for this one. And let's just see what's going on there. Okay, so EQ wise on that guitar, like it sounded pretty good going direct, but obviously you have to EQ and work it into the mix. Let's see what I did. I gave a couple dBs at about 7.5, and I took out a notch at about 180. And that is going through the Golden Age LA3A clone compressors. It just gives it, I love those compressors on guitars. It smooths things out, it makes it warm, and it sits really nicely into the mix. So there's a little bit of compression going on there, not too much. And I must say, I did automate the volume from the beginning 4 bars a lot louder than when the voice kicks in. And that's pretty much the only automation that I did on this song. As far as effects on that guitar, it's running through the Lexicon PCM80 on a concert hall setting. And I also have it going through my Bus 7.8, which was I have my TC Electronics M300 effects unit on there. And that's being brought into the sub mix. That has a little bit of a tremolo effect as well. You can kind of hear it tingling. And the other effect that I put is a slight delay from the Korg SDD-3000. I set that up with a 1/8 note delay. So yeah, let's just hear that again. And let me just play everything else that kicks in. Okay, so yeah, I had the vocals muted, but everything kicks in right there. So at the end of those 4 bars, I have a piano, kind of a dark sounding piano, that is being compressed through the Drawmer TS2 compressor with the tube engaged. So it really warms it up and it just gives it a certain sound. I love that on piano. And as far as delay, I'm running this particular piano through the Moog Mooger Fooger, and you can hear the nice distortion on that delay. Let me just play that piano on its own. I absolutely love analog delays. When I was mixing in the box, I couldn't quite find anything in the box that can really replicate the analog delays, and I just love it. So yeah, that kicks in, and then there is an organ, very subtle. And as far as effects, what I did with that organ is I ran it through the Vermona spring reverb, and I panned the spring reverb full right. So I just want to play it before and after just so you can hear what that does. There's no effects. And there it is. So it makes it a little bit vibey. I like planning effects hard left and hard right. It just opens things up. But that, along with the piano and the guitars, I think it sits really nicely. And I guess I should just go and make you listen to the drums as well. So the drums, I used my Alesis electronic drum kit to trigger it, so I played it right through. And then I just have a track of kick, the main snare, and then I doubled that track again, so then I can kind of do like a parallel mix on the snare. Then I have a hi-hat, and then I have the left-right, which is basically whatever is left, the toms and the ride and the crash. So it's going through there. All the drums, I must add, are going through the main stereo bus right there, and then bus 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, and those are separate parallel compression buses that I set up. One is an old Korg compressor. I think it's a Key C-42. You can check a link in the description for all the gear that I use if you want to go through that. And the other compressor is the DBX 168A. I think, let me just see. Yeah, that's it. So that's a stereo compressor with a de-esser. It sounds really good on squash drums. So let's just play the drums on their own. So EQ wise, I'm pretty happy with how the sample sounded. I didn't do too much anything too radical. The kick has a little bit at like 100. The snare, the main snare, I brought up 12K a little bit. And then what I did on the second snare track, so let me just play you. The first snare track sounds like this. And as far as effects, I'm using the PCM60 room patch from the Lexicon MPX 550. I just love that on drums. So this is the main snare. And the second snare, what I did is I used it to fatten up the original one. So this is the second one on its own. You could hear it's a lot fuller in the low end. So I boosted a lot at, I think it's like 200, 250. And blending that with the brighter sounding snare, I think it sounds good together. And the hi-hat, I just made it a little bit brighter. I took out a notch at like 200. I took out another notch at around 4, and I brought out the highs significantly. And you can hear the drums. So this is them on their own. And now this is with the 2 parallel buses engaged. As you can hear, that parallel bus really makes it more exciting. And the next thing I should just break down is the vocal, and then we'll hear everything kicking in together. Well, actually the bass. So for bass, I recorded it live into the Chandler Preamp Direct, and I wanted it really fat sounding, so it's going through my Joemeek VC6Q compressor. I boosted a little bit of 100 on the actual unit, and then on the board I boosted some more at 60. So it's really fat and round. I put a tiny bit of the PCM60 room reverb, and this other effect is just a stereo spreader from the Quadraverb. So this is with nothing. And that's with the stereo spreader. And I think with the drums, they lock pretty well together. So let's just hear the bass and drums there. Okay, now the last element for now is the vocals. So vocals, I recorded through the Manley Reference C. The vocals usually sound pretty finished by using that mic because of the, you know, kind of the tube sound that it has. And it's a really bright sounding mic. So I didn't have to do too much EQ wise. I boosted a little bit at 12K. I brought a tiny here at 7. Took out a tiny notch at like 2, I guess that's around 200. And let's just hear the vocal on its own. Sorry, I had it muted there. I tried to be perfect, but nothing was worth it. I don't believe it makes me real. So as far as effects, I set up a plate, fairly large reverb time on the actual plate with a really long pre-delay on the Roland R880 effects processor. And then there's a tiny bit of delay from the Korg SDD-3000. You know, on its own it sounds like a lot, but in the mix I think it really works really well. So let's just hear everything coming in together. So as you can hear, it's a pretty mellow build up so far. There's just guitar. The organ is pretty subtle in the back, and there's elements of piano, you know, just throughout. I put in a few notes here and there, kind of give it some vibe, like that. And then everything kind of breaks going over here. And now the other two elements that I have coming in to bring, you know, to create more excitement. So on the next verse, I dropped the organ and I brought in a cello. So the cello is going through this old compressor I have, EP141. I usually save that for background vocals, but since there's no background vocals, I ran the cello through it very lightly. It sounds great. And the same thing with the violin, going through the same compressor. Now the cello kicks in. It's panned hard left with a big reverb hall from the Roland R880. That's a separate one that I set up just for that. And the violin is panned hard right, and that kicks in a little later in the song. Oh, sorry, right there. So there's constant excitement being created throughout the song until the end. And yeah, so let's just hear how the cello, like the second verse, kicks in the cello, and then the violin comes in at the end. This place is so empty, my thoughts are so tempting. I don't know how it got so bad. Sometimes it's so crazy that nothing can save me, but it's the only thing. So as you can hear, there's constant build up throughout the song. From the beginning, there's just the guitars, and then everything kicks in. There's the light drum pattern, and then to the end, there's the cellos and the violin just to bring more excitement. EQ wise, I think I should mention, the cello, I did nothing to it, and the violins, I just brought up a little bit of, I think, like 7K. And that's it. Usually, like I said, I've mentioned this in previous tutorials. When I was mixing in the box, you have to do a lot more work to get your stuff to glue together. So typically I'd set up like tape saturation, distortion on most tracks to try to emulate the console kind of glue. But through a console, oftentimes just running the track through it, I mean, you listen back and you don't really need almost anything. You don't need hardly any EQ. It's just, that's one of the benefits of working on a console. Obviously the negatives, there's no recall. There's a lot more work if you have to recall it like a month from now. You have to take a lot of notes. But if you don't have to worry about that stuff, this is the way to go for speed and efficiency. But yeah, that's basically it. So typically when I mix, I usually start with the drums and lock it in with the bass. And then as you're bringing in elements, you have to really hear how they're affecting each other, because sometimes you can't just go and really start EQing things on their own. Like if you're doing corrective stuff, that's okay, but you have to start really EQing things within the content of the entire mix. Because if you don't do that, you have to see how frequencies play with each other from different instruments to the vocals, and then decide what you need to carve out if you need to create space for another instrument or for the vocals. So I typically, I bring up the drums, just typically how I mix. And then I'll bring up the bass and make sure that the kick and the bass don't really clash. And then you start bringing in the instruments. Violin. And really listen, if there's any frequencies that are clashing. And the main thing you want always is the vocal to stand out. I mean, that's usually the goal. So you have to make sure that that frequency where the vocal sits in, that there's nothing really interfering with it. And if there is, you're going to have to carve out a little notch where the vocal sits. And there's other things that you can do. You can, maybe through effects, you can spread a vocal, put a little bit of chorus on it, and compress the chorus. I mean, there's so many tricks you can do, but you got to do whatever works for that mix. But that's basically it. My drums, bass, lead vocals, cello and violins, left, right guitar, piano and organ. And yeah, there's not too much heavy compression. Oh, I guess I should have mentioned, so the lead vocal is going through the Klark Teknik 1176 and LA2A compressors. That's my typical vocal chain that works pretty much always. I don't really have to mess with it much. But yeah, I have the it goes through the 1176 first, kind of taking care of the peaks, and then it goes into the LA2A. Because I find if you're just using an LA2A on vocal, if there's a lot of dynamic in the vocal, just the LA2A acts funny sometimes. You have to kind of tame the peaks before you hit it. I think that's, for me anyways, that's the best way that it works. And yeah, that's about it. Drums, kick and snare are being compressed through the DBX 160 compressors. Snare and hi-hat, I have that on a channel that's always running through a Presonus compressor. There's not much compression going on that. Same thing with the left and right drums. Bass, I already mentioned, it has the Joemeek compressor and a tiny 100 boost at 100, and there's more EQ on the board. Cello and violins, that's going through the EP141 compressor. I don't know what company that makes it. And then, as I mentioned, the guitars, left and right, LA3A. That LA3A, if you're looking for a very versatile compressor, the Golden Age LA3A emulation are fantastic. I mean, I wouldn't hesitate to buy another pair of those because they sound good on pretty much everything. It's like the perfect combination of 1176 and LA2A in one. It sounds great on guitars, pianos, synthesizers, drums, like you name it. And then, yeah, piano and organ, compression-wise, that's going through the Drawmer TS2 with the tubes engaged. I usually love that unit for that. And that's it. And right now, what you're not hearing is the final mix going through the Warm Audio 2-bus compressor. The way I set up my mic, I'm getting a lot of feedback off the monitors when I engage this, so it's not engaged. But be sure to click the link in the description so you can hear the final mixed song. So you'll hear it with going through the bus compressor. And as I mentioned in other tutorials, I'm not a mastering engineer, but I do my own basic mastering. So I'll bounce the mix through the bus compressor. I bring it back into Cubase, and then to optimize the levels, I run it through the Oxford inflator and usually boost a few dB off of that. And then I follow it with the Sony Oxford limiter. And between those two plugins, it gives me very competitive levels without really squashing the life out of things. I don't really like to squash things. But that's it. Be sure to click the links in the description. I will have a link to all the gear that I've used. And if you have any questions about this mix or any questions about future tutorials that I can possibly review of certain gear that I have, feel free to leave me a comment and I'll do my very best. Thanks so much.